Morning conference participants, thank you so much for coming to day 2 of MEI's annual conference, the Middle East Pivot China's BRI between geostrategy and commercial opportunity. I'm sure that the discussion today, like yesterday's, will be very illuminating. We will begin our first panel on the religious network along the BRI, so I'll pass it to the chair, Professor Liow.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. I must apologize, I missed yesterday's proceedings, but I'm sure it was fascinating given the topic. I suspect that this morning's panel, the one that will kickstart the discussions for the day, will be no less fascinating. Yesterday, I presume that there was discussion about the commercial, geopolitical aspects. Today, we get into or at least the panel this morning is supposed to discuss religious networks and more broadly cultural and historical links that I think are a very important element of the between geostrategy and commercial opportunity. Yeah. So it's a very important topic, and we have assembled, or MEI has assembled, a very solid panel. 3 of them are here. James Dorsey is on his way, but he's an old friend of mine, so I take the prerogative as chair and old friend to start without him, and he'll just have to catch up. Now, in a fit of mischief, I think I'm going to go by reverse order from the program that you have. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to start with Mohammed Turki, and I prepared him, so he's aware of it, so don't worry. And we will go in reverse order in that way, and hopefully James will it gives James 20 minutes to get here. The panelists will speak for about 20 minutes, after which there he is. The panelists will speak for about 20 minutes, after which we will open the floor for questions. So without further ado, we welcome James, and we kick off with Mohammed Turki. We're going reverse order, James, so you're up next.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the Middle East Institute for giving me the opportunity to come back to Singapore. I really missed the place, so it's very nice to be back in a toastier place. Surprisingly, Hong Kong has been a bit cold lately. So my presentation is going to be divided into 3 parts. The first part, I will essentially try to describe a phenomenon I've noticed over the past few years that is shared by many states across Eurasia. And I say Eurasia primarily to include some of the European states which exhibit some aspects of this trend, if not completely. Although this is primarily relevant, I would say, to the Gulf states, Central Asia, Russia, China, and a few others. The second part looks at how this phenomenon is specifically impacting the Sino-Gulf Islamic transnational networks. And I mostly focus on Saudi Arabia and its ties to China, but I think these comments are also relevant to the UAE and Kuwait, which are also sort of major nodes of these networks. And then the third part, I will try to explain why this phenomenon has emerged. And I've left it in the third part primarily due to time considerations, because there's a lot of content that I want to go over, and I just want to give you the meat. And if people want to ask why that has happened, you can do so in the Q&A, I guess. So without further ado, I'll just begin. So one of the major themes that we've looked at over the past few panels is essentially the theme of connectivity. And the focus has been primarily on sort of the hardware aspects of it, the development of infrastructure in the form of ports, high-speed rail, highways, and the like, that facilitate the movement of capital and labor. And one aspect, of course, in these connectivities is the movement of peoples, primarily imagined as tourists, as consumers, and the like, because essentially the BRI is imagined in very economic terms. But one aspect, of course, of this increased mobility is the movement of ideas, religions, customs that accompany the movement of people. This has always been an essential quality of trade. Religion follows trade. And if you look at sort of the framing of the BRI, essentially, this is also celebrated. the primary mover of the BRI, the Chinese Party State, speaks of the BRI as offering an opportunity for cultural dialogue and civilizational exchange, as a new type of globalization. And oftentimes they evoke the romantic images of camels on desert roads along the Silk Road routes. There's also a lot of scholarship that is increasingly being done about sort of the ideational project that is being undertaken through the BRI in terms of how, for example, the Chinese state is attempting to reshape political and legal norms, and also how other smaller regional entities within the context of the BRI are co-opting some of its images in their overall local ideological projects. If you think about, say, the United Arab Emirates and its narrative of cosmopolitanism, the presence of a Chinese diaspora under the rubric of the Belt Road Initiative is oftentimes invoked. So in many ways, this movement of peoples, at least superficially, is not a problem. But what's interesting is when one looks at the past few years, particularly with regards to the religious sphere, and here I'm speaking of Islam, which I'm more familiar with, but I would argue that there are aspects of this that are true with respect to certain types of traditions, is that there has been an almost contradictory trend taking place, which I would sort of like to call a religious Westphalianism. And here I'm sort of evoking the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, and even the preceding sort of Peace of Augsburg from 1555, where essentially, in the context of the war of religion in Europe, the norm of religious sovereignty was accepted and became sort of a core aspect of the international regime. That is to say, the prince decides the religion of the state, and that authority will not be contested or subverted by other actors. And non-interference will be at the core of the interaction of these states. And in many ways, actually, there are many aspects of this religious Westphalianism that are reappearing in the context of what should be a very highly globalized world, where we should have a tapestry of religious exchange and development. And I would say that this religious Westphalianism in the contemporary era is marked by 2 or 3 major features. The first feature is that we see many states across Eurasia really try to break down pre-existing organic transnational networks. There's a very active effort using different conventional tools, cutting off financing, limiting the movement of certain preachers and clerics, deinstitutionalizing certain organizations that sustain these transnational networks. The second and more interesting feature that I would argue is that many states currently are undertaking projects of constructing what I would like to call national Islams. That is to say, the narrative that many states increasingly present, and I think this is particularly true in the Gulf, but also in China, if you think about the last 3 years, for instance, with the sinification of religion policies that had been unveiled since April 2016, is the narrative that states are promoting is that there has been an indigenous type of Islam, or expression of Islam, that had been hijacked by external elements that promote, radical or foreign expressions of Islam, and that these have subverted the indigenous practices that we are accustomed to or have had since time immemorial. And so these states are using different types of institutions and tools to promote discursively an Emirati Islam, a Saudi Islam, a Chinese Islam. I mean, it's interesting that this is also taking place in the heartlands of Islam per se, where that narrative should not necessarily be relevant. And the third aspect of it is that now we see a much greater advance of the state within the religious sphere. That is to say, the state is almost trying to assert its authority within religious spaces that have traditionally not really hosted the imagery or symbology of the state. Right? There's almost an attempt to ensure that the icons of the nation state are present in the religious sphere. So this is the overall sort of situation that I've noticed over the past few years, which goes against the overall developments that have taken place under the BRI. So aspects of this can already be felt in the context of Sino-Gulf interaction. So here maybe I'll give a few examples of how the state is increasingly intruding and trying to maintain greater surveillance and monitoring over religious interactions. So since 2 years ago, actually, the Chinese party state had begun to ask pilgrims to actually carry with them GPS markers to make sure that their movement in the context of the Hajj is well monitored. Now, of course, I think that there are legitimate concerns for the installation of these types of GPS monitoring systems, primarily because if you see how the pilgrimage operates, there's considerable crowds, there's also genuine security concerns that come with it, but they're also part of an attempt to ensure that pilgrims keep to their religious rituals. Because historically, and I think Janice will be talking about this, the Hajj was a very important conduit for pilgrims to meet their relatives in Mecca, in Medina, and Jeddah, and probably stay over. And eventually they would go into religious institutions or potentially pursue their own businesses in the context of the Hajj and even afterwards. And this is part of the mechanisms of ensuring that people don't do that and that they don't necessarily overstay in Saudi Arabia. Another aspect of this intrusion is, and this is something that I've worked on recently, is that we see a heightened utilization of the United Front. So essentially, the United Front Department is one of the arms of the Chinese Communist Party. It's utilized essentially to ensure the co-optation and loyalty of different segments of the population, both domestically within China and also internationally, to help ensure that they can work towards realizing certain interests or goals of the Chinese Party or the Communist Party. And since 2014, there has been a major push to reactivate and expand United Front activities all around the world. And I'm sure a lot of you have followed the news and the debates that have been taking place in places like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, with respect to the diasporic Chinese communities. But what's been interesting is that people have ignored that this has also been taking place in the context of the Gulf. I mean, the UAE gets a lot of attention in terms of that type of activity, but Saudi Arabia, which hosts its own long-standing Sinophone communities, the communities that Janice looks at closely, have been a target of these United Fronts. So you have more renewed pushes on the part of officials to engage these communities, to monitor, to write reports about them, and to ensure that they are not necessarily repositories of potential dissent, whether in terms of funding secessionist movements within China or necessarily promoting propaganda that would be considered anti-China. And I should mention that their focus is not just limited to the Hui communities within Saudi Arabia, which are estimated to be around 1,000, 2,000 or so, but also the Turkestani community. And Saudi Arabia probably hosts one of the largest communities in the world after Turkey, diasporically speaking. We don't have any exact figures, but it could be anywhere between 60 to 150,000 people who actually claim descent from what we would consider today as Xinjiang. And of course, the terminology itself is very problematic because Turkestani could also mean West Turkestanis. But you do have a very large component that come from Xinjiang proper. Another aspect of sort of this disruption that is taking place in the context of transnational Islamic movements is also the toll that it's taking on Salafi movements. And this is, again, a sort of connectivity that I've looked at in past research. These ties have developed since the 1980s in the context of sort of the under-table diplomatic engagement between Saudi Arabia and China. And during that period, a lot of Saudi-backed international organizations such as the Muslim World League and so forth came to China and began to develop clandestine ties with some of the local Salafis, particularly in the Northwest, in places like Gansu and Qinghai. And eventually, through these ties, some of the figures from these communities managed to obtain scholarships, whether to Saudi-backed universities in places like Pakistan or Malaysia, or went straight forward to Medina University, which oftentimes is the main institution that hosts foreign scholars. And what's interesting is that one particular figure who would be considered the head of the Salafi network that I followed, he was a Salar, actually, and not a Hui. So this is a Turkic minority in China, but he only speaks Chinese. He eventually went to Saudi, and he cultivated very close ties with the Saudi ulama, including actually Ibn Baz, the Mufti of Saudi Arabia, or the former Mufti of Saudi Arabia. And through that connection, he managed to funnel money to establish schools in the Northwest, and he also developed a considerable clout, primarily becoming the conduit through where scholarships are funneled. So he would send his disciples to Saudi Arabia, then bring them back to essentially man the schools. Now, these types of connectivities have endured at least for 30 years. But now what we're seeing is because of pressures coming in from the Chinese state as well as the Saudi state, these connections are becoming somewhat disrupted. Both because, on the one hand, there is greater scrutiny about the movement of this type of money, and especially this fears related to the Salafiyya presence in the Northwest, which I think are problematic in their own right. But on the other hand, we're also seeing the Saudi state itself put pressures on benefactors and patrons of these types of movements. And this is limiting and disrupting these movements. So I'll give one example of that. This figure here on the right is Awad al-Qarni. He's a famous preacher in Saudi Arabia. He's been under arrest since 2017, I believe. This figure is known to be sort of at the ultra-conservative side of the spectrum in many ways. He became very famous in the 1980s, primarily for writing several polemical books against the liberal intelligentsia in Saudi, in the context of what we would call the modernist debates, where essentially the Saudi liberal intelligentsia, when it was in retreat during the religious revival of the 1980s, tried to put forward some of its intellectual critiques against this religious upsurge through discussions on how to modernize literature. So he wrote actually a very big book called Al-Hadatha fi Mizan al-Islam, where he essentially deconstructed and destroyed these movements. So he became very famous, but that's not part of the core part of the story. In any case, over the last 5 to 10 years, Awad al-Qarni became very interested in China. And he actually conducted multiple tours in the country. He visited various Salafi mosques. And he was also attempting to actually establish a TV station in Ningxia to promote Arab culture. It's interesting, this playing with terminology is a very long-standing Muslim practice in China, which I always find very endearing. And you'll see it with another group that I'll talk about in a moment, where usually the Chinese term or the English term that is presented is always very clinical. They would use oftentimes the Sino-Arabic school or something along those lines. But then when you look at the Arabic translation or rendition of it, it's like the Islamic school. It's completely different, the purposes of it. But they know how to frame and they know how to address different audiences. But in any case, these Salafiyya networks have been under pressure. Unfortunately, I tried to obtain more data on how this is impacting, for example, the number of people from the mainland who are still receiving scholarships in Saudi Arabia, and whether there has been a decline. I've not been, unfortunately, able to obtain it, but I know, like, for example, from 1982 to up to 2000, the year 2005, around 600 scholarships were given to people coming from the mainland. And more recently, in 2017, Janice was really kind to share this with me. The number of estimated Chinese in Medina University in 2017 was roughly 350, if I'm not mistaken. Now, whether there has been disruptions or not, it would be interesting to look at it. I'd like to get more data on that. Now, the other aspect also of how this, sort of religious Westphalianism is also impacting these transnational networks, and I'll probably end here, is missionary organizations. So over the last few years in the Gulf, there have been multiple da'wah organizations that have popped up all across the board in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, that are essentially catered to the conversion of Chinese speakers. These are tailored to target specifically Chinese overseas, but some of them also have long-term projects of converting Chinese within mainland China. Of course, they never got to that, but that's a different story altogether. Now, what's interesting about these different organizations, and there's this one particular organization that I followed, which is, again, here is the interesting sort of differences in terminology. So in Arabic, it's called the Calling Chinese to Islam Center, while in Chinese, it's the Zhongsha Wenhua Jiaoliu Zhongxin, the China-Saudi Cultural Exchange Center. In any case, this particular center, what's interesting is that because of the pressures they're beginning to feel, both within Saudi Arabia and China, they have begun to change their messaging. So nowadays, they are increasingly trying to position their religious outreach and work as part of the Silk Road Initiative. And they've sort of launched a Silk Road program of enhancing cultural methods of communication and so forth, and sort of trying to de-emphasize their religious work aspect, which is still part of their core work and core activities. But this reframing is really indicative of the current moment, which is both to ride on the bandwagon of sort of the Belt Road Initiative and its growing strength, but also on the other hand, it's a protective measure in many ways. And I can talk a bit more deeply on any of these aspects if people are interested, but I think I'm sort of running out of time, and I won't be able to get to my third part, which is to explain why this is happening. So I just wanted to give people a general taste of these developments, and if anyone is interested in asking why, I would be more than happy to use up 10 minutes in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next up, we have James Dorsey.
Thank you, and apologies for delaying this session, but blame it on Singapore traffic. When I started initially to map out what I wanted to say today, I was going to thank the Middle East Institute for two things, not only for inviting me, but also for dropping the hot potato on me of this conference. And that was when I thought I was going to be speaking about the situation in Xinjiang and its impact on relations with the Middle East. Then when I looked at the program yesterday, I saw that the topic had been changed or broadened out to speak about human rights and China's attitude towards human rights more broadly, and realized that the thank you for the hot potato was all the more in place. Let me start off with Xinjiang by saying that when it comes to the crackdown, the question is whether it is the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog. Or in other words, is China leading the charge to undermine accepted concepts of human rights, including freedom of religion, as well as accountability and justice, as a result of the criticism of the crackdown? Or are the crackdown the accelerated rollout of a 21st century Orwellian surveillance state and the export of some of its key elements, expressions of a broader, more fundamental desire to redefine human rights? On balance, it seems to be the latter, given that the redefinition strokes with already challenged, long-standing Chinese foreign and defense policy principles, such as non-interference in the internal affairs of others, and an economics-driven, allegedly win-win proposition. The Chinese effort goes to the core of the struggle to shape a new world order. It is a struggle that is as much about power and spheres of influence as it is about values such as human rights, accountability, and justice that would undergird the new world order. The Chinese effort to shape those values in its mold is multi-pronged. It ranges from the total disregard of accepted norms, as is evident in Xinjiang, which constitutes an almost unprecedented attempt to rewrite, at least in practice, the norms of a faith, to support of often arbitrary autocracy and authoritarianism, to proposals to alter the principles on which institutions like the United Nations Human Rights Council operate in ways that would enable repressive regimes. To be fair, China is not the only country that would like to change globally accepted norms to the detriment of human rights. Muslim nations, with Saudi Arabia in the lead, have long, for example, sought to criminalize blasphemy. China is waging its campaign at a crucial juncture in history. It benefits from the rise of ethno and religious nationalism, populism, intolerance, and widespread anti-migration sentiment, sentiments that are as prevalent in China as they are elsewhere across the globe. The campaign is enabled by the emergence of presidents like Donald Trump in the United States, the Philippines' Rodrigo Duterte, Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Hungary's Viktor Orban, and Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, who have either de-emphasized human rights or gone as far as justifying abuses, in addition to seeking to limit, if not undermine, independent media that hold them accountable. Within the context of the struggle to shape a new world order, China and the West's diametrically opposed concepts of human rights involve a battle for dominance over the future of technology and global influence. Freedom House, a Washington-based freedom watchdog, reported last year that China was exporting to at least 18 countries sophisticated surveillance systems capable of identifying threats to public order, and systems to another 36 that make it easier to repress free speech. It amounts to a passing on of Chinese norms for how technology should govern society, the most extreme example of which is Xinjiang. The timing of the Chinese effort is significant because it comes at a moment that predictions of the death of popular protest, symbolized by the defeat of the initially successful 2011 popular Arab revolts, are being called into question. Yet, mass anti-government demonstrations in Sudan demand the resignation of President Omar al-Bashir. Anti-Chinese groups march in Kyrgyzstan, while protests in Zimbabwe decry repression, poor public services, high unemployment, widespread corruption, and delays in civil servants receiving their salaries. The past year has also seen widespread anti-government agitation in countries like Morocco, Jordan, and Haiti. The protests, and what Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Ross describes as a resistance that keeps winning battles, suggests that China's campaign may have won battles, but is yet to win the war. One of those battles is China's success last year in pushing a non-binding resolution in the Human Rights Council that effectively amounts to the beginning of a process that would wither away the UN human rights ecosystem. In a sign of the times, the resolution garnered significant support. The United States, in a twist of irony, was the only council member to vote against it, with countries like Germany and Australia abstaining. The council, the resolution, in the words of Human Rights Watch China Director Sophie Richardson, gutted the ideas of accountability for actual human rights violations, suggesting dialogue instead of accountability. It failed to specify any course of action when rights violators refuse to cooperate with UN experts, retaliate against rights defenders, or actively reject human rights principles. And it even failed to acknowledge any role for the Council itself to address serious human rights violations when dialogue and cooperation don't produce results. Mrs. Richardson warned that if these ideas become not just prevailing norms, but also actual operating principles for the Council, victims of state-sponsored abuses worldwide, including in Myanmar, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, will face almost impossible odds in holding abusive governments accountable. China effectively wants intergovernmental cooperation instead of accountability. Government officials discussing among themselves with no discussion of accountability for abuses and no participation of independent groups. The question is what China's next step will be, whether it will be more aggressively seeking to change the Council's mandate or to alter the language of treaties or roll back the role of civil society. China's efforts are both an attempt to rewrite international norms and counter sharp Western criticism of its moves against religious groups, including Christians and Muslims, and its crackdown in Xinjiang. Against that backdrop, it remains to be seen whether Turkey's condemnation this weekend of the crackdown in Xinjiang marks a watershed. Granted, Turkey is no carrier for human rights and on many accounts supports China's approach. Yet the condemnation constitutes the first major crack in the Muslim wall of silence that has enabled the crackdown in Xinjiang. The condemnation's significance goes beyond developments in Xinjiang itself. Like with Muslim condemnation of Mr. Trump's decision last year to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Turkey appears to be wanting to be seen as a spokesman of the Muslim world in its one-upmanship with Saudi Arabia and to a lesser degree, Iran. While neither the kingdom or Iran are likely to follow Turkey's example anytime soon, the condemnation raises the stakes and puts other contenders for leadership on the defensive. The bulk of the Muslim world has remained conspicuously silent, with only Malaysian leaders willing to speak out and set an example by last year rejecting Chinese demands that a group of Uighur asylum seekers be extradited to China. Malaysia instead allowed the group to go to Turkey. Interestingly, the Turkish condemnation came days after 4 Islamist members of the Kuwaiti parliament organized the Arab world's first public protest against the crackdown in Xinjiang. The Turkish condemnation could have its most immediate impact in Central Asia, which, like Turkey, has close ethnic and cultural ties to Xinjiang and is struggling to balance relations with China with the need to be seen to be standing up for the rights of its citizens and ethnic kin. In Kazakhstan, Turkey's newly found assertiveness towards China could make it more difficult for the government to return to China Serkan Yolaçan, a Chinese national of ethnic Kazakh descent and a former employee of a re-education camp in Xinjiang, who fled illegally to Kazakhstan to join her husband and child. Mrs. Yolaçan, who stood trial in Kazakhstan last year for illegal entry, is the only camp instructor to have worked in a re-education camp, teaching inmates Mandarin and Communist Party ideology, and spoken publicly about it. She has twice been refused asylum in Kazakhstan and is appealing the decision. China is believed to be demanding that she be handed back to Xinjiang authorities. Similarly, Turkey's condemnation could impact the fate of Kalimbek Shaman, a Chinese businessman of Kazakh descent who is being held at the airport in the Uzbek capital of Tashkent after being denied entry into Kazakhstan. Mr. Shaman said in a video clip from Tashkent airport this weekend that he had left Xinjiang because he no longer could deal with having his identity checked every 50 to 100 meters. A guide for foreign businessmen, Mr. Shaban said he was put out of business by the continued checks that raised questions in the minds of his clients and persuaded local businessmen not to work with him. The fact that China is to some degree susceptible to pressure is evident in the fact that it recently agreed, in a bid to pacify criticism of its Xinjiang policy, to allow some 2,000 ethnic Kazakhs to renounce their Chinese citizenship and leave the country. The decision followed Mrs. Sautbai's testimony in a Kazakh court that she had worked in a camp where 2,500 Kazakhs were being held, and that she was aware of 2 more camps where some 5,000 other Kazakhs were detained. Her revelation sparked criticism in Parliament and on social media. At the bottom line, China's assault on human rights, as well as concepts of accountability and justice, fits a larger, long-standing pattern of support for autocracy and authoritarianism that is packaged in the language of noble principles, but in effect is no different than US policy, particularly in the Middle East. It's a policy for which the United States has paid dearly, and with the undercurrents of change sweeping the Middle East and North Africa, could ultimately come to haunt China. Already, one of China's most immediate problems is a growing perception that its principle of win-win economic cooperation often amounts to little more than China wins twice, both economically and geopolitically. It is forcing China to focus in the short term less on the great game, the rivalry with the United States and its allies for dominance in a swath of land stretching from the China Sea to Europe's Atlantic coast, and more on ensuring that it does not lose hard-won ground. The hollowing out of norms underlying concepts of human rights, accountability, and justice reflects an often broader absence of globally accepted standards in China's approach to the Belt and Road, such as with its support for the kind of dirty power projects in Central and South Asia and Africa, which the People's Republic has banned at home because of the increased cost of carbon pricing and air pollution regulations associated with coal-fired power plants. Climate change scientists warn that those projects could significantly heighten the risk of climate change. President Xi Jinping has capitalized on the American withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the landmark United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, by projecting China as a leader in environmental good governance. In 2016, Mr. Xi called for a green, healthy, intelligent, and peaceful Belt and Road. He urged participating countries to deepen cooperation in environmental protection, intensify ecological preservation, and build a green Silk Road. On paper, Chinese environmental good governance looks good. The problem is that the government's guidelines are non-binding and often ignored. As a result, Mr. Xi has yet to back up words with deeds. China is developing some 240 coal projects with a total generating capacity of 251 gigawatts in 25 countries that include developments in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Kenya, Ghana, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, and is also funding new coal capacity in Egypt, Tanzania, and Zambia. Many of those projects do not incorporate carbon capture technology that would align them with global efforts to control climate change. In conclusion, whether it's human rights or environmental standards, the fundamental issues are the norms that shape the world we live in. Human rights are often relegated to the backbench, with geopolitics and economics being the bigger fish to fry. Yet they constitute a key pillar and a battleground in determining what a future Eurasian world will look like. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Janice, you're up.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, and I'm grateful to MEI for having me here. And I'm also glad that the previous two speakers set up the present context of Islam in China somewhat, and because in the presentation I wanted to suggest the potential of Muslims in China to act as diplomatic or commercial or cultural intermediaries between China and West Asia by going back a time a little bit before the Belt and the Road. And as just in case that some of you may not know, there are some 20 million or more populations in China who are understood as Muslim populations inside the territories of the PRC, who are categorized into minority nationalities, and one being Hui and one being Uyghurs. But these so-called Muslim minorities in China and elsewhere, and definitely also in Singapore, I think, have in fact inhabited much wider geographies, whether through networks of pilgrimage, education, kinship, commerce, or religious imaginations that get activated at different points in time. And from the perspective of states, these external ties are sometimes a liability that need to be cut off or controlled, as in the present. But at other times, it can be an asset that they can somehow capitalize on. So I wanted to focus on a juncture when Muslim networks in China acted as a kind of asset in various aspects before the BRI, and that is in the 1980s when PRC was just opening up after institution of its open up and reform policy. So after the institution of open up and reform policy in 1978, there is liberalization on multiple aspects in internal to China, and that's related to external relations. That would be relaxation of religious sphere within the PRC, and also designation of economic zones for external trade in specific areas, and also search for new relations with new allies as it was building new alliances, and new alliances with the countries that had been in the opposing bloc. And one of them was Saudi Arabia, that had in fact had very strong ties with Taiwan, or Republic of China, based in Taipei, until Saudi recognized Taiwan in 1990. And during this decade, when diplomatic relations was absent between the PRC and Saudi Arabia, I would argue that interactions between the PRC and Saudi Arabia started through religious connections on both societal and state levels. So I wanted to talk about how these different channels of religious networks could be utilized by different parties on the state level and regional initiatives and also individuals. So first on the diplomatic front, I would say that by this time, both in Saudi Arabia and PRC, religious networks were institutionalized into semi or full governmental agencies as something that could be utilized as a means of cultural diplomacy. And within the PRC, this was through the Chinese-Islamic Association that was technically established after the founding of the PRC, after communist victory, but its origins went back to the years of the World War II, when China and Japan were fighting on a war in various aspects, and Republican state was in one way imitating Japan's Islam policy of creating connections with Central Asia, networks across Arabia and Central Asia and China as a way to penetrate into China and Southeast Asia. But so I wouldn't go so much into that, but Republican China and Communist China, in a way, both inherited that legacy of utilizing Islamic networks as a means of foreign policy and cultural propaganda when official diplomatic relations were absent. So PRC and ROC both sent pilgrimage delegations in the 1950s and up to 1960s until PRC kind of disappeared from the scene, both competing without when what was going to happen was not so clear and the agendas were not very set yet. And meanwhile, in Saudi Arabia, in 1962, World Muslim League was established in Mecca, which from the perspective of Chinese states, it is kind of has religious religious orientation, as Mohammed said, but it's also a diplomatic organization for Saudi Arabia to engage with countries like Taiwan and mainland China when there's no when the agendas are not clear on both ends. So in the 1960s, ROC, or type based in Taipei, uses these world institutions such as World Muslim League and pilgrimage delegations to interact with authorities, religious or political authorities in Saudi Arabia from all the way from 1950s to the 80s. So you see these images of encounters between Hajj delegations from Taipei, meeting figures of the World Muslim League and having encounters with ministers and kings and so on up to 1980s, and the World Muslim figures also visiting Taipei and giving donations and creating kind of semi-diplomatic connections along with official diplomatic connections. But what's interesting is that in this period of 1980s, the World Muslim League was also interacting with the PRC Hajj delegations, whereby the representatives of the World Muslim League were also visiting PRC and touring around different sites and giving donations and creating contacts, as Mohammed said, and vice versa, with the Hajj delegations kept on going to different places, Mecca and Medina and Jeddah, and it's hosted by the World Muslim League that would take care of the itineraries and lodgings of the PRC delegations up to 2001, which is pretty recent. But it's difficult to put hands on what exact conversations were taking place. But it's what I'm trying to say is that these religious diplomacy through Chinese Muslims and through Mecca and pilgrimage in the 20th century was a constant means for Chinese states to exchange contact with Saudi Arabia and other states in between before immediate interest became really clear on both sides. And what's also interesting is that these religious channels could be also utilized by regional authorities within PRC in the same period of 1980s. So with the opening up in the 1980s and the setting up of coastal regions as special economic zones, there's also an awareness in western regions of China, including Xinjiang in the Muslim areas, that West Asia or Islamic world in general should be an external connection that can be an asset for the provinces or these regions that have large Muslim populations. And that is the boundary of Ningxia autonomous Hui autonomous region. And for in Ningxia, for example, in 1980s, you see these arguments that the region needs to open up to the Islamic world and in line that, and also cultivate linguistic skills and make connections with the Islamic world market and attract investments from the Gulf. And there's also sense and arguments that Xinjiang would live off of external connections to the borderlands, which was actually taking place in the 1980s. And coastal regions would live off of exchanges across the oceans. So this Ningxia, that is kind of inland, needs to also open up to the target the Muslim world and set up Incheon Inland Special Economic Zone simultaneously. So there is this active discussions in the 1980s on also opening up of forums for discussions on Ningxia International Economic and Technological Cooperation that is attended by embassy personnel within the PRC, like Kuwait and Pakistan. But because Saudi Arabia did not have a diplomatic representation at the time, what the chairman of Ningxia did in 1985 was to organize a Muslim friendship delegation and visited Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, Kuwait, and Yemen, and the UAE. So it was a way for him and the delegation to enter into Saudi Arabia without diplomatic relations, again coordinated by the World Muslim League and officially received by them, and perform a pilgrimage to Mecca and also to Medina, and also go to Riyadh and do all these things and have conversations with religious, political, and commercial dignitaries during the visits. And it's not so clear what was happening at the time, what exact conversations were going on, and I don't have images of it. Unfortunately, it wasn't accessible when I was researching this. But at the same year, after the visit, in Ningxia, there's organized Islamic International Economic and Technological Cooperation Forum that is attended by 20 countries. And also on the same year, Islamic Development Bank funds religious and Arabic schools of $4 million US dollars, and half of it goes to Ningxia and is used to establish Islamic Scriptural School of Ningxia in the capital city of Incheon, which was complete in 1989. And from what I gather from other people's research about 4,000 or 5,000 graduates have come out of this school. And what's interesting is that only 5% of the school graduates have been engaged in religious work. So others have gone to commercial centers in the coast like Uighur or Guangdong to work as translators over the 30 years, which is like a worry for the religious personnel as well, because they attend these schools, but they also go off to other paths to do other things. So these initiatives in the 1980s, it's not really, it didn't pick up immediately, and so it kind of slowed down in the 90s, and it seems like it picked up again in the mid-2000s, with Ningxia branding itself as a market is an international market for halal industry, and also hosting these China Arab Expos that I believe it was held for the last time in 2017. But there are, of course, tensions in the naming of the expo as well, because it used to be something like on a consultative meeting on halal food and Muslim products. But in 2010, they changed the name to China Arab Expo, or China Arab Luntat, and then it was changed to Expo. So it's kind of indicative of what Mohammed was discussing. But what I mean to say is these connections between Ningxia and West Asia, it seems like the mood was set in the 1980s, although it didn't pick up quite immediately. So this sense of having to go into West Asia through informal or civilian visits, there needs to be more research, but there's a connection between 1980s and the present as well. So, and lastly, I wanted to say how these religious channels could be utilized as from the perspective of individuals as well, who are not necessarily related to the state authorities of the center or the regional governments. So this is it's more anecdotal episodes that I have from interactions with Chinese Muslim community or second or third generation community based in Saudi Arabia, who have settled there since 1950s, 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And with the opening up of China in the 1980s, although there's no diplomatic visits, these settlers who have grown up in different parts of Hijaz could now go back or meet their relatives coming for the Hajj and reunite with them for the first time in 3 decades or so. So this was a person whom I met first in Ta'if, which is close to Mecca, about like 1 hour drive away. And he had born and raised in Ta'if, but because his half sibling from Gansu province made the pilgrimage in 1983 with the pilgrimage visits visa or family relative visits visa. In 1983, he could reunite with them through the pilgrimage, and there were many other cases like that I heard from my interactions. So after these reuniting of families and visits back and forth, as soon as diplomatic relations were normalized in 1990, the siblings started like to do peddle trading between China and Saudi Arabia by selling these little products like carpets and vases and decoration products. Because the half sibling who had been in Ningxia was already doing similar things from 1981, visiting Guangzhou and Beijing, as he said. So it was not so difficult for him to experience different environments in Saudi Arabia when I asked him. So, and also, what's interesting is that he also started new kinship relations with the extended family back in China, and basically married in China and got married in China and the couple came back together in Ta'if and now are settled there. And as soon as and that kind of made it possible for him to bring in not only his half siblings or cousins, but also the brothers of his wife and the brothers and the husbands of the wife's sisters. So there was an active exchange going on for the past 3 decades, where they started to get things from Guangdong and sell these things in the fairs, in the standing fairs in different cities in Saudi Arabia, going between Jeddah and Riyadh and Dammam and selling these things in these stalls. And he eventually started to import or purchase tea in Guangdong and set up a stall in Jeddah and Ta'if to basically sell tea. And he had ambitions of expanding the business to Riyadh as well in the future, and also writing a book on the history of tea in China. So there's an active exchange going on through that case. And there were also cases of existing Chinese Muslim community, the first and second and third generation, beginning to have new relations with relatively newly arrived people from different parts of China through by starting new marriage relations or getting sponsorship visa from the existing community. So there were a case of 2 guys from Qinghai province in Xinhua who were graduates of the Islamic University in Medina in 1994. And then after graduating, they started selling the clothes, like the white robes, thawb, from their hometown, which is in Qinghai, which is an inland province. But they started to bring it and ship it through Shenzhen. And they had offices in Dubai and Jeddah. But because they needed sponsorship, they got the sponsorship from and a lady who had Saudi citizenship but who was not working. But they were basically from the same hometown and all. And there was also a family opening a new restaurant in Ta'if who was married into the existing Chinese Muslim community. So these small traders may not be so significant in size, and that these traders who started in 80s and picked up in 90s, they're not so significant in size. But together with these state-sponsored pilgrimage delegations and regional outreach to West Asia, as in the case of Ningxia, I think these together, these different layers indicate that the social capital of Muslim networks has continuously existed in history in China and elsewhere, and it's a flexible kind of interactions that can pull in different actors when relations are not so set yet in diplomatic arenas. And these are networks that have regularly benefited China's empires and 20th century nation states, which became activated before official diplomatic relations. So I think it's a historical trend that Chinese Muslims have played in certain moments and sometimes in extended periods of time roles as cultural ambassadors and commercial and diplomatic mediators. And it's a resource that can be cultivated and appropriated for tangible exchanges and symbolic soft power. And I think we need to do more research on these engagements between China's Muslim populations, both the Chinese Muslim populations that I was talking about, and other groups, including the Chinese-speaking and Turkic-speaking populations, how their individual and regional, through their individual and regional levels, they have engaged with the wider geographies of the Muslim world and with the BRI. Yeah.
Thank you, Janice. Serkan, please.
Right, I guess the hot potato is with me. My presentation will respond to two questions that came up at the end of yesterday's last session. One of them was, can Turkey and China find a common ground around the Uyghur problem? Is it at all possible that Turkey and China can work out, can have a working relationship around the Uyghur question? And my short answer is, it is possible if the two parties are bold enough, and I'll explain how. And the second question or the comment that came up at the end of the last session was that China is almost exclusively working with states. It's prioritizing state-to-state relations in its expansion across Asia. And that, was there any benefit for China if it was to work with non-state actors as well? And I will present a case in which working with non-state actors can actually benefit China. And this is about the Uyghur question. And I presented a version of this paper 4 years ago, again in Singapore. And at the time, the Uyghur question was very much on the news. The Belt and Road Initiative was in its infancy, and it was obvious for observers that the Uyghur problem had to be solved. But at the time, different options were still on the table. There were possibilities, including the option of integrating the Uyghurs into the BRI, as the BRI expanded into South Asia, from Xinjiang into Central Asia, the Caspian Basin, onto West Asia and Europe. 4 years later, today, those in Beijing seem to have made up their mind about how to go and solve this problem. And I summarize it as follows: integrate the land, that is Xinjiang, and isolate the people, the Uyghurs. My opinion is that this will not solve the problem in the long term. It will only augment it. But the question is, could China do differently? So the Uyghur question has so far received a limited international audience, comprised of a handful of Western liberal internationalists and Turkish activists who cooperate with the Uyghur diaspora, stationed mainly in the US and also Turkey. Conferences and seminars in Washington, D.C., or protests on the streets of Istanbul may be ineffective at the moment, but the broader silence should not be taken for granted. Deeper entanglement of China in the Middle East and possible future bumps in Turkey-China relations can certainly break the silence and create a major hurdle for Chinese foreign policy. And this is already happening every now and then with statements coming from the foreign ministry in Turkey. From Beijing's perspective, the Uyghur problem augments if and when it becomes an international cause for Muslims around the world. If the Palestinian conflict offers any perspective for us, Islam as a rallying cry against foreign occupation or internal oppression, however you may want to call it, will keep Muslim publics attuned to the cause. For this reason alone, the Chinese leadership's confidence within its borders will be vital to freeing its hand beyond its western borders. But again, could China do differently? If Muslim connectivity is inevitable, as China integrates Xinjiang into the rest of Asia, how can Beijing ensure its internal hold over an externally connected Muslim population and further benefit from their economic integration to this Chinese expansion? To solve the conundrum, I suggest that China needs models of Muslim connectivity that goes beyond its three evils doctrine of fighting against terrorism, separatism, and religious extremism. Now, on the question of Muslim connectivity, the view from the Middle East is rather bleak. As relatively strong states of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran compete for influence in the region, they tear apart societies in between, entrenching sectarian conflict as primary conduct of international politics. As grudges accumulate within and across borders, they gather momentum and find grandeur in the larger-than-life narratives of early Islamic history. So seen from the Middle East, Muslim connectivity implies a cycle of coercion and revenge with a dim prospect of social cohesion. So for inspiration, then China needs to look elsewhere. And I suggest it can look to the Caspian Basin, for instance. Post-Soviet countries surrounding the Caspian Sea, and also in Central Asia as well. Here, the heated waters of the South, that is the Middle East, calm down under autocratic regimes running on oil and gas. Former Soviet republics in the Caspian Basin are far from what they appear to be in the early years of the Soviet breakup. The chaos and the conviviality of the early 1990s gave way to autocratic stability. So the priority of the post-Soviet leaders has been to ensure internal stability while keeping their countries externally connected for higher shares in the export business. And this double agenda, which is internal stability and connectivity, external connectivity, has reified those very borders, giving each state a clearly demarcated zone of sovereign control. There are few territorial disputes, and there's little violence comparatively in Central Asia, in the Caspian Basin. So what we have in here is an interconnected region with solid national borders and what Robert Kaplan called once flinty states, which is a stark contrast to the Middle East, where boundaries are dissolving into frontiers and states into tribal, ethnic, and religious networks. So Muslim connectivity in the Caspian Basin looks different from the way it looks in the Middle East. Even as the Muslim populations in the Caspian Basin of the former Soviet republics invite sectarian movements of the Middle East to this area, the autocratic states keep them in check and regulate the border crossings. This in turn creates a push for domestication. For one, Muslim communities, if they want to stay in these countries, have to streamline their charity networks, religious curriculums, proselytizing activities, and publications along the lines of what is permitted by each regime. And second, they have to embrace political quietism. in the Caspian Basin, Muslim networks cannot discard borders as they do in the Middle East, but have to reckon with them. Now, the question is, what are the typical Muslim communities that are known to work well in such settings as the ones that I described, where borders trump frontiers? So for the rest of my time, I will try to show how two Muslim communities have done particularly well in such settings. One of these is the Erenköy community, and the other one is the very controversial Gülen movement, which is led by a self-exiled Turkish preacher in the United States and now considered a terrorist organization in Turkey. So you may ask how dare I bring up a terrorist organization as an example of an orderly movement of sorts. To that, my answer is very simple. I'm not interested in the movement itself, and I'm not even propagating actually that China should work with this network. I'm interested in the model that the Gülen community has provided us, and which I think could be replicated to a certain extent by other Turkish Muslim communities, which work with the Turkish government as well. So both movements, so this is the leader of the Erenköy community, Osman Topbaş, in prayers with the mayors of Ankara and Istanbul. And there is Fethullah Gülen, I believe in the Caucasus or Central Asia in the early 1990s, with teachers and businessmen surrounding him. So both movements blossomed in Turkey in the 1980s in tandem with the burgeoning Muslim businessmen, which are known as the Anatolian Tigers, and hatched out into the Caspian Basin following the Soviet breakup, sending hundreds of volunteers to the former Soviet republics in the Caucasus and Central Asia. While the Erenköy community later on expanded to the Balkans and Africa, the Gülen community went truly global. And tellingly, both communities are the least active in the Middle East, where the competition is waged rather violently and in frontiers. Urban followers of a state-employed preacher in Izmir, Fethullah Gülen, and wealthy disciples of a Naqshbandi sheikh in Istanbul, on the right, were the original communities that eventually grew, in both cases, into a loose network of teachers, students, professionals, and businessmen by the 1980s. The institutional backbone of these movements has been Waqf, inalienable religious endowments through which growing wealth in Muslim hands was channeled into acts of piety and social solidarity, particularly in the education sector. So while these Waqf, these foundations, provided Muslim businessmen with a platform to engage in pious philanthropy, the ever-growing web of schools, dormitories, teachers, and scholarships ensured the recruitment of new members. Especially in the case of the Gülen movement, which prioritized secular curriculum, a successful educational career coupled with access to business and professional networks meant upward mobility within and horizontal mobility abroad. So by the 2000s, the Gülen community had not only produced elite cadres in Turkey's workforce, it had also spun businesses and schools from Southeast Asia all the way to Latin America. The Erenköy community, on the other hand, established its presence as far south as sub-Saharan Africa, where it raises the next clerical generation, some of whom will fill official state positions as imams, preachers, and religious scholars. Now, one of the key points I want to make is that both movements articulate well with autocratic capitalism. As orderly movements focused on education and business, both communities invest in the political stability of the countries where they are present. Now, this is, of course, a bit of an irony given the conflict between the Gülen movement and Turkish government in the recent years. But just forget that episode or Gülen movement at its home base beyond this discussion. I'm basically talking about the operations of the Gülen movement beyond Turkey. So as Gülen movement as a diaspora. So they are very invested in the political stability of the countries they are present in. And this implies a hands-off approach to domestic issues, corresponding to the Chinese model in imperial expansion, I would say, and political quietism in the Islamic tradition. Both movements prioritize close relations with state elites. Sorry, I don't want to skip something. Okay, both movements prioritize close relations with state elites and adaptation to the legal regime in place, regardless of how authoritarian the political system may be. In fact, authoritarian governments interested in capitalist development offer an advantageous setting where these movements, once they establish trust with the political leaders, can proceed swiftly, set up business ventures, linking them up with the wider network through which they finance the construction and management of schools, bringing teachers from abroad and providing scholarship to students. So from the perspective of the autocratic governments who receive these foreign Muslim volunteers, the advantages are many. For one, it means politically loyal foreign capital and education of future elite cadres at no cost. Not only does the regulatory power lie with the government, but the latter, so the government, has also a say in the curriculum of these schools. In Azerbaijan, for example, where both movements had a very strong presence and still do, the schools had to display the portraits of Haydar Aliyev, the ex-communist post-Soviet leader, whose son now rules the country. And the portraits of the father and son are to hang in classrooms, their messages displayed on the walls and at the beginning of textbooks. The government also inspects all the material used in the classroom and the curriculum as well. So this compromise on the part of these foreign communities establishes them as trustworthy institutions in the eyes of the state, who in turn depend on them for their business and education. The Gülen community's bilingual schools often rank among the top schools in the countries that they were established. It is not a surprise that many of these schools are attended by the children of state elites. And it is this symbiotic relationship based on political quietism and capitalist development that allowed these movements to survive the so-called war on terror. While many autocratic regimes were pressured to kick out, say, Iranian mullahs and Gulf charities by post-9/11 America, Erenköy and Gülen communities managed to stay and flourish. So what the Gülen and Erenköy communities offer to these autocratic regimes interested in capitalist development is a type of transnational Muslim connectivity that does not undermine national order, but one that works with it. They give order as they connect, and in that, their pragmatism trumps theology. The priority, the focus of these communities, particularly the Gülen community, for example, is to produce a socially upright, intellectually promising, and economically dynamic generation of Muslims who are linked up in a network of businessmen, statesmen, scientists, professionals, and cultural producers. These young Muslims are more invested in a civilizational view of Islam than meticulous theological debates. They stand out from the stereotypical citizenry of autocratic regimes, which often comprises a complicit majority that is politically emasculated, and a minority in political opposition that is socially castrated. So with their international outlook, language skills, educational background, and political quietism, these Muslim youth offer an alternative way of incorporation to the autocratic system. So from the perspective of the leaders who are hosting them, this means streamlined clerics and a Muslim middle class with a stake in the status quo. When individual empowerment through external connection generates social stability rather than political subversion, it appears as if done by magic. So from the perspective of the recruits, the horizontal ties of these movements and a civilizational view of Islam offer them a historically informed order that empowers them not vis-a-vis the state, but beyond it. So in conclusion, I want to say that China needs to look beyond the vertical to the horizontal. Instead of looking at the Middle East, where the horizontal implies a chaotic frontier, Beijing should turn to the Caspian model of bordered connectivity and the Turkish model of orderly movement as one way of solving its Uyghur problem. The more China focuses its energy on fighting religious extremism, the more it risks turning Islam into a rallying cry for Uyghur insurgency. As Uyghurs become more integrated into Central and South Asia, this implies a cycle of violence and repression. So the Chinese leadership can benefit from Turkey's Muslims, not necessarily these movements, but there are many other movements in Turkey that are willing to work with the Turkish government in breaking that cycle that I just said, by inviting them to set up businesses and schools in Xinjiang and regulating them as it wishes. Their business ties outside and political quietism inside could articulate Uyghurs into the Silk Road economic belt and to Beijing simultaneously. This requires China to reconsider its view of Turkey as a hotbed of radicalization where Uyghurs join jihadist or separatist networks, which may be correct to a certain extent. China can come to see in Turkey's Muslim movements an ordering force that gains momentum through education and business. It is worth emphasizing that these movements follow the Hanafi madhab, school of Islamic jurisprudence, which is what Uyghurs have traditionally followed as well. So this gives Turkey's Muslim movements a significant advantage in articulating their presence with local traditions as well. So instead of having Islam as a rallying cry against the Chinese rule, Islam can become the medium by which Beijing can offset the liberal internationalists and pan-Turkists in Istanbul while preventing the Uyghur question from becoming an international Muslim cause. Articulation of Turkish Muslim business and educational institutions to the Chinese expansion can be a mediating instrument between Xinjiang and Beijing. Thank you.
Thank you, Serkan. Thank you, everyone, for keeping to time. Now we have about slightly over half an hour for questions and answers. Let me open it up to the floor. Could you please identify yourself before you pose your question, and if necessary, let us know who in particular you are posing the question to. Yes, sir. Then yourself.
Yes, hi. My name is Janice Jeong. I'm in investment management. I have one question for Dr. Mohammed Turki and one question for Dr. Serkan. So my question for Dr. Mohammed Turki, I think it was a very interesting and also arresting concept, the religious Westphalianism and its Eurasian turn. Now I'm wondering, I just wanted to clarify, when you talk about the Eurasian turn of religious Westphalianism, I presume you're not referring to the whole of Eurasia, because I guess Europe already had its Westphalian turn, and then East Asia has a very different religious culture. So am I correct that your concept, you're really applying it to the middle part of Eurasia, to the Middle East, to Central Asia, and to countries that have, that although politically might not be in Central Asia or Middle East, but have populations that culturally, ethnically are part of Central Asia, like China and Xinjiang, for example. So turning to my question to Dr. Serkan, I think the idea of the Gulenist model for China is very interesting. I'm curious though, given how you explain that Gulenism works well with incumbent authoritarian regimes and doesn't seek to create waves, could you perhaps explain to us then how is it that it came to such a massive rumpus with Mr. Erdogan? Thank you.
Please. Thank you so much for your question. I think the religious Westphalian term is more a descriptor of the current moment, at least to my mind. It's not necessarily a concept. It just simply, to me, there appears to be an emerging consensus among varied elites about the need to, on the one hand, manage and contain external influences, and on the other, they want to pursue managerial projects internally, with culture writ large, but with the religion specifically being one venue for that type of managerial approach. And it's an interesting, and I call it really a descriptor because, you know, it's interesting when you compare to the 1970s and 1980s, which was really the high tide of sort of the global religious revival that was taking place across many different religious traditions, and where states were somewhat retreating in the face of this religious revival, and in some ways attempting to co-opt and instrumentalize the different networks and sort of religious upsurges that were happening. Now, with regards to the term Eurasia, I was also sort of thinking of Europe, and therefore I chose this Eurasian term because while you see this distinct practice taking place in the context of Central Asia, China, Russia, where there is a cultural statecraft towards religion, as well as the Middle East, you do see in the past few years in Europe projects of creating a liberal Islam writ large. This has been pursued at varying levels, for example, in the discourse of an Islam informed by Danish values or German values or British values, and the creation of institutions and centers that are very similar to the cultural or thought security institutions that I've looked at in the context of my work in Europe, but which you see much more pronouncedly so in China or in Saudi Arabia, for example, that do this type of managerial work. It's, you know, less pronounced, but it's there, that tendency. So therefore, the term Eurasia seemed more apt and more broader and inclusive. Thank you.
Yeah, the story of Gülenis in Turkey and the story of Gülenis abroad are very different two stories. So, and it is indeed a whole lecture on the Turkish case. So, one thing is that there had been very little oversight in Turkey around on the Gülenis, and in fact there was a very active partnership between the government and the Gülenis, and that which brought the Gülenis deep into state institutions, including army, judiciary, and the police force, which is something that is unlikely to happen abroad, which hasn't happened abroad unless any incumbent government would be willing to go that far. So in that sense, I think there are certain historical political limits to how much the Gülenis could do abroad in terms of aspiring, for political power. But within Turkey, they had a completely different story, a longer history first. Second, a partnership with Turkish governments, not only with with Erdogan's government, but early on in the 1990s as well. As Islamists and secularists were fighting within Turkey, actually the Turkish government was partnering with the Gülenis in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and elsewhere. So there's a very different trajectory that took place in Turkey that I won't go into detail so much, which I think is not the model that I am proposing. I think it's critical. It's also, one last point, wherever they go, they almost take on, they're very malleable. So in the US, they have, Gülenis have the image of politically liberal, moderate Muslims, which has to do with maybe them being very useful for the US during post-Cold War in the Caucasus and Central Asia, creating that green belt stretching across, dividing Moscow and Tehran. So that, but elsewhere in Africa, they're not known at all as liberal and moderate Muslims. They have a different face. So, but that was just a model that could be replicated with other Muslims. Thank you.
My name is Shikata. I'm from Japan Forum International Relations. Let me ask Dr. Dorsey and Mr. Yolaçan respectively. In Japan, there are a number of Uyghurs, Tibetans in exile. They have been protesting against China for many decades. We have a very big concern about in Xinjiang, there are maybe as many as 1 million Uyghurs in detention for the purpose of re-education. In fact, they seems to be encouraged to learn Chinese language, to praise Chinese Communist Party. They seem to be less encouraged to keep their own language and religion. So our media has been reporting all over the world about the serious problems in Xinjiang or maybe even Tibet or in other minority areas, but that's not strong enough to prevent it. So what should the rest of the world do to stop such movement in China? Particularly, how should Muslim community can do? In fact, the relationship between Muslim countries and China is growing economically and politically. They must have some reservation to say anything against China. So there seems to be some contradiction between political, economic relationship and religious relationships. I would like to welcome your comments from both gentlemen on what to do about that. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take a few more questions while you ponder over your responses. The gentleman there, Ing Sing, and then Zainul.
My name is Louis Tek Kyung. I'm from China ASEAN Business Association. My question is directed to Dr. James Dorsey. How do we balance the need for a clean human rights record as a precondition to trade versus the need of the population to be gainfully employed and the country to have a thriving economy? Would the imposition of human rights record as a precondition to trade be viewed, or can it be construed as protectionist in nature and also anti-competitive as well?
Ing Seng Ho Middle East Institute. I guess my question will be directed at the panel. It seems to me that there is a strong theme going through the panel, and I would say it is this. If we take 1979 as the starting point, you have the Iranian Revolution, you have the Soviets going to Afghanistan, and what this means essentially is this, that from 1979 onwards, you have transnational push for interconnectivity across the world in two dimensions. One is in an Islamic dimension, in which you now have competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia in a very state-driven mode, which gives you a theological, ideological push across the world, number one. Number two, with the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the US goes in and lets loose Saudi Mujahideen for 1 decade in Afghanistan, again, in this state-driven, ideological, theological mode. With the US going to Afghanistan in the 80s, and with, at the same time, the big push for globalization under Reagan and Thatcher at the same time, what you have in the 80s is both global capitalism and Islamism both going global from the 80s onwards. We're very familiar with this story. What happens is in 9/11, the Islam global part starts to get pulled back in places like UAE leading the charge. With the rise of Trump and Brexit, the globalization push out starts being pulled back by the champions of globalization, the Anglo-Saxon capitalist countries. So what we have today, I think, sets up what Mohammed was talking about, this Westphalian system, Westphalianism doubling down, which is to say, pulling back the Islam theological thing. Now, on the globalization side, Many people don't like the pullback of Brexit and Trump tariffs, saying you are going in the wrong direction. Now, the question for the Islam side is, should there be a pullback or should you continue forward? This is where I think the last two speakers, Janice and Serkan, are interesting because their studies of Islam are not all state-centric, but with individuals, with social movements, which are not, in that sense, then directly ideological or theological, but have multi-level participation. So in that sense, is there a difference between state-level discourse, which we all are so familiar with, versus this social level discourse? And if this social level activities actually have the sort of power and flexibility that Janice and Serkan are talking about, should we actually think more about these sorts of connectivities? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's a lot to deal with. So maybe we'll take this set of questions first and then we'll go on to the next. Please. Maybe James, you want to go first? Sure. Have a couple.
Thank you. Let me take the first and second question together, maybe what to do and whether or not human rights is a precondition for sustainable economic development, if you wish. I think the point I was trying to make is that there are no absolutes here. With other words, it's not that we should be engaging, or maybe we should, but will be engaging in absolute boycotts for multiple states that abuse human rights in various ways. The point I was trying to make, and I think that's also what my answer to the question would be, is that that one needs to maintain yardsticks. One needs to maintain some degree of norms and standards. And there's going to be deviation from those norms and standards continuously, and how one deals with those on a case-by-case basis remains to be seen. But what I'm seeing happening is that very yardstick, the very norms and standards by which we make judgments, whatever we do with that in practice, is being called into question. And if you indeed get to a situation where you are obliged to accept the narrative of a given government, then I think you're entering into very dangerous ground. On the issue that Eng Seng raised, two things. One, I think 1979 was an accelerator and took things to a very different level. But the role of transnational movements, both in terms of the Islamic world, as well as in terms of the United States, they go back to the Cold War and relationships with the Muslim Brotherhood that the Americans had, predates 1979. What I would like to do, if I may, is abuse this moment for a second and actually take Eng Seng's question and throw it back at Serkan. No, the reason I want to do that is that conceptually I thought what Serkan presented was extremely interesting. The question is that in effect, that's what the Turks and the Chinese were discussing a decade ago in the wake of the 2009 Urumqi protest, when the Turks were offering for economic development in Xinjiang. You were getting the opening of a direct flight from Istanbul to Urumqi, and all of that broke down essentially when the Chinese decided that that was not the road they were going to travel, and that they wished to do this in their own way. And so, which really means it's like with many conflicts, at the end of the day, you got to be willing to solve it, or have a willingness to solve in order to be able to engage. And the Chinese decision was they had their solution, and there was no engagement.
Still just
Serkan, Janice, can I take a step? Also just leaving. Okay, Serkan, it's yours.
It will not be specific answers to each question, but just an overall comment, I guess, also related to James' point. Usually when we think of government policies and how to change them from outside in, we have certain standard narratives. These are usually Western narratives about what is good governance, and you know, what are the yardsticks for human rights, what are the ways in which local government should be run, or the relationship between the people and the government should be, so on and so forth. And then we bring it up against a big power like China. Then China has the luxury not to listen. So, because it really has it can afford some countries cannot. If they're not powerful enough, then they have to listen to the big powers, right? We had the Cold War. If you are a client state, then you didn't have much of a choice. You had to apply one of the models. So one suggestion, one way in which we could be effective as scholars, activists, what have you, businessmen, in changing the course of history would be to produce models that can be very practical, that has real historical resonance, that has real connection to the actors that are already operating, and encourage governments to be bold in solving the problems that they face using these models. Otherwise, a grocery list of a shopping list of things that they have to do rarely works. So that's that's the reason why I maybe worked hard on trying to come up with a model in which the Chinese can work with. And I'm actually surprised to hear that was actually because I didn't know that there were actual negotiations between Turkey and China as to apply this sort of integrated model.
I think sort of the timeline, Dr. Ho, that you've set up is a very interesting one, because I think when we look at sort of the rise of sort of this global Islamism hand in hand with globalization being unleashed in the late 1980s, it's very interesting to look at how things were playing out in the eyes of states that were not necessarily part of the liberal democratic tradition, which are really many of the states in Eurasia. And essentially what began to happen is that many of these states were beginning to think seriously, how can we contend with the threat of globalization, primarily in the sense of there was this very hegemonic discourse in the 1990s, which was that ultimately liberal economic engagement will yield to democratic transition. Right? For the Chinese, there was the issue of the Soviet collapse in the background. There was also Tiananmen. And I think many other states also had these concerns considerably. And actually, if you look at, say, the political science fields, both related to the Gulf as well as to China, it's interesting that the main themes and focuses of a lot of scholars is essentially about regime resilience and transitology, right? So what happened among these states, I would say, is that they began to think seriously, how can we ward off this problem and this dilemma? And so there began to be a very active investment in research on issues like cultural security, thought security, and also how to obtain an orderly globalization by building up the bureaucratic apparatus. And I think we've reached a moment now where many of these states have developed sufficient institutions and bureaucracies to manage it. And I'm not saying it's necessarily successful, but they have the wherewithal to do, and they also have the technological capacity to pursue these things. And this, I think, to a certain extent, explains what's happening in the Gulf and China. Okay. In terms of where do we go forward from here, I mean, I think the biggest tragedy is that unfortunately there is a very considerable lack of a nuanced take on religion and the reality of how religion is experienced and expressed. So you find this very almost clinical and systematic approach to religious networks, to religious communities, that is very devastating and very tragic. I mean, in the case of China, you see a very active attempt not only to alter existing sort of modes of organization within religious communities, the Hui, which I'm most familiar with, but there's also an active attempt to suppress visibilities that outsiders think is an indicator of foreign intrusion, right? So there's a systematic demolition and rebuilding of mosques along the style of Buddhist temples. There's an active campaign across the country that I've noticed in all the provinces that I've visited, whether in Henan, Yunnan, or the Northwest, where the Arabic language is disappearing. I mean, Yinchuan was a few years ago presented as the center of Sino-Arab trade. The city had Arabic signage everywhere. That has completely disappeared last year. Not a single Arabic sign exists. But there is this very ramshackle approach that is really very destructive, and there has to be a considerable rethinking on the part of various leaderships whether this is the best take on controlling and counteracting maybe very serious security concerns. But there has to be an admittance that religion operates within a gray zone, and that many activities maybe that are not necessarily accepted or prescribed by the state law should be left to their own devices. I think I'll stop here.
So, can I invite Zainal and then Yusuf, and then Yusuf? So 3 questions.
Thank you, Joseph. My question is related to the issue of model Muslim minorities and where do we turn to? And this is specifically to China, and whether, in fact, if I like what James said, there are no absolutes. It's evolving, it's changing, the world is changing, the Muslim world is changing, it's in a turmoil. So what kind of model can we look outside of China? And whether, in fact, what Sudairi mentioned about there's no utility anymore in terms of Islam, in terms of bilateral engagement, or whether what Janice has said in terms of the seeds of relationships, whether it's Mecca and China and Muslims reconnecting with their diaspora. So if I may just, Joseph, just with your indulgence, my own personal search for that model for Muslim minorities, especially for Singapore, brought me to many parts of the Muslim world, including Turkey. This was, must confess, in the mid-70s and early 80s. And I quickly dismissed that Turkey was not a model. It was too advanced, too secular for the reality of the Muslim world then, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. And now with the Turkey, with the geopolitical considerations about how Turkey is seen by Saudi Arabia, by the Gulf, and by some other regions, so by America too. Ironically or not, I came to the conclusion that the best place for Muslims to be, Muslim minorities to be, was in America. It's open society, emphasis on education, science and technology, the number of Muslims serving NASA is an example of how Muslims should actually aspire to serving the world. But that, of course, that was before Trump. So my question now is, China, is China underestimating the value of that Muslim utility, the Muslim diaspora, and connectivity, especially with the Middle East? And whether, in fact, China understands what's happening in the real Muslim world, and whether the Muslim world understands what's happening in China, and whether, in fact, how China is facing Muslim minorities among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as against the Hui Muslims. And they are totally different things. I was in Hui'an, Jiangsu province last October, and it was a totally different experience. The amount of respect which Chinese, local non-Muslim Chinese show to the Muslims in Hui'an was amazing. Compared to what I read about what's happening in Xinjiang, where I felt ashamed myself that the Muslim world is not speaking up against what's happening in Xinjiang. So my question now is China underestimating this Muslim world, the need for connectivity with the Muslim world in Middle East, and in fact taking advantage of the kind of Islam, the kind of relationship that we have, and can bring about better relations between China and the Middle East and the Muslim world?
I'll try to be brief. First of all, I agree with the colleague that in the United States, despite some popular unease, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, and involvement of over 1 million Americans in deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Muslim life is free. You can go to the mosque, you can worship, you can send your kids to a religious school. It's all there. At the same time, there are popular sentiments against Muslims, Jews, Latinos, blacks. That's life. That's how things in the United States are. Take it, leave it, fight it, do whatever you want. But my question is to the two gentlemen who study transnational networks. 9/11 was a reaction, or post 9/11 US engagement and mobilization of US allies was a reaction to a massive terror attack. And it looks like things are calming down, including the US pullout, gradual pullout from places like Syria, from places like Afghanistan, and Trump's attempt to pull out of it, or Obama's attempt to pull out of Iraq. US remained in Iraq in reduced modality and possibly will pull out a little bit more. But the engagement, and we talked about it yesterday, the engagement is declining. The transnational networks like the Gulanis, like the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, are here to stay. The question to Professor Yolaçan is how the Gulen movement is going to survive Gulen. Gulen is not a young man and he's not a healthy man. To what extent it will remain Turkey-centric, and to what extent the Turkish government will try, as I would if I was advising them, to somehow take over or incorporate. And to what extent, as we see the contradictions between Ankara and Washington remain, to what extent the strategic alliance of Mr. Gulen himself personally, and to some extent the network with the United States and parts of the US government that we all know and love, how that may or may not survive Mr. Gulen. The question to Mohammed is, we saw an attempt to build a strategic alliance, I would say, with the Muslim Brotherhood, especially under the Obama administration. The Trump administration is not in the same boat. How do you see the future of the Muslim Brotherhood vis-a-vis the West and in the Middle East and in places beyond the Arab Middle East? Are they succeeding? Are they declining? Who is the competition? What's the future for the Ikhwan? Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser Saidi. I'm going to have a relatively simple question, and at the same time, a very complicated, I think, question, addressed really both to Mohammed and to Serkan. For somebody who's lived nearly all his life in the Middle East, apart from being in the States, Europe, and other, what strikes me is that during the 60s and 70s and 80s, and as globalization was taking place, we were gradually moving to becoming more secular across the Middle East. And there's a narrative in a reading of history whereby if you look at American intervention, particularly in Afghanistan, and support of the jihadi movements, then you have 9/11, there was a resurgence of Islam, also as a protection of one's identity. If you are attacked from the outside, you go to what you feel secure about. And religious identity is one of the ways you get security. At the same time, if we look at what happened with so-called Arab Spring or Arab Firestorm, the core of it in many cases with the Muslim Brothers and others was always nearly Islamic movements. And people when they were repressed, could always meet in the mosque. And that generated political Islam in many ways. So my question is, we've concentrated a lot about China. I want to look back at our part of the world and ask the following question, building on your Westphalian introduction. It took Europe, after they killed each other and probably hundreds of millions killed, it took them maybe 150 years or so, 200 years to separate religion from state. One of the issues I think we need to address is, when do we in the Middle East start separating religion from state? And is there a possibility, and what are the elements for us to help separate religion from state? Because once you start going to the concept of separating religion from state, then a lot of the issues that we've been dealing with fall in the background. So it's a simple question and a highly complicated one. But at the same time, I think it goes to the core of many of the issues that we need to address. Thank you.
Always be careful when they say it's a simple question. We're running out of time, so can I request that you keep your answers short and pithy? We'll just go down the table, starting from Mohammed.
It's difficult, but I will answer one very quickly. With regards to the Muslim Brotherhood, I am not touching that with a 10-foot pole. This is, I think, better for everyone. And I'm not informed, in fact, about sufficiently to talk about that in any granular fashion. Regarding Dr. Nasser Saidi's question, I really appreciate it. Although I have to contest the narrative that you present of that the trend was of secularization in the 1950s and 60s. I think that's part of the rhetoric of modernization theory and sort of the inevitability of that process and the creation of secular societies. And in fact, in the case of Saudi Arabia, right, in many ways, the religious revivalism that took place, which might actually support your point or not, was something that was state-led. In the 1950s and 1960s, Saudi Arabia faced domestic leftist opposition that was growing. There was a Saudi Communist Party, Ba'athist elements, and different other movements that were challenging state authority. And there was also the context of the Arab Cold War, where there was an ideological challenge presented by Arab republicanism. And what happened is that the Saudi state began to actively invest in creating an ideological alternative by bringing in Muslim Brotherhood elements, by bringing in other Islamists, opening up the doors, establishing institutions like the University of Medina, the Muslim World League. And that actually paved the way for the eventual Sahwa in the 1970s and 1980s, right? So in many ways, there is that dynamic that we have to take into consideration. Now, touching on your question specifically, I think the key element is that the state needs to begin a process of withdrawing from the religious sphere. But this is a habit that is very difficult to break. But the primary actor is that of the state. I think in terms of society writ large, maybe modernizationist theory is probably true for the current moment, where we're actually now beginning to see, in the last few years, there's been multiple interesting books and scholarship done, including one by Brian Whitaker from Al-Bab, I think, about the rise of, for example, very secular, agnostic, atheistic tendencies within Arab societies, right? And basically a drop in religious observance. And you can actually see that the salience of religious fault lines is declining somewhat. Like, we've been suffused with sectarianism for the last 15 years. But now you can see a shift in terms of, for example, how does one speak of the conflict with Iran? So that it's no longer, for example, framed as a Safawi Shiite threat, but now it's a Persian imperial threat, right? So there is a shift in frame that I think is indicative of some changes that are taking place at the societal level, whereby the state really needs to maybe begin rethinking its approach to religion and letting things play out naturally. I mean, these are my sort of basic thoughts on it. I don't know.
Zainul, I think rather than approaching it as a question of underestimation, that it's more a question of the glass is half full or half empty. Particularly because in the whole discussion about Xinjiang and about religion for that matter in China, we're conflating three, in a sense, separate issues. You know, first of all, you have a situation where the Chinese systematically refused to look at the problem in Xinjiang as an ethnic issue and deliberately turn it into an Islamic issue or a religious issue. The result of that was partly then, subsequently, with the rise of the jihadist movement, particularly in Syria, that you had Chinese nationals, many of them Uighurs, joining particularly the Islamic State in Syria. And the concerns that the Chinese had with that, and then what I would describe as an overstatement of what the threat constituted. And then you have, somewhat more recently, the whole issue that the Chinese state or the party is taking issue with religion as such, of which Xinjiang again is the extreme, but it's not just Muslims, it's evangelists, it's other groups. So I think you've got a much more complex situation in which a lot of things are being thrown into one big bowl, and really you're dealing with a number of separate issues that are interconnected and have consequences.
Yeah, I would add that Xinjiang is, I understand it also as a territory issue, as well as being a religious and ethnic implications. So the separate status that Chinese Muslims or Hui people have, and the Uyghurs have, in my understanding, there are differences in historical and linguistic and cultural differences. That is true, but it's not as clear cut as the PRC has made out to be in the recent decades. To me, Xinjiang is more of a issue of geography of Xinjiang, it being inherently more connected to Central Asia and South Asia and to West Asia, that makes, in a way, especially the modern nation states in China, have anxieties about it not really fitting within its mode of governance of being as a homogeneous nation state. So I think that would require a fundamental redefinition of how China sees itself historically and in the present, and how Xinjiang historically has been managed or governed prior to the establishment of nation states, different nation states in the 20th century. So if it could look back in the pre-20th century times and how it was managed through local elites, and who could play in between roles between the local populations and the center. The expression is that the heaven is high and the emperor is far away. So I think Chinese nation states should take lesson from that.
I think it is impossible for the state to withdraw from religion in places where religion has incredible social depth, and Middle East is one of those places where what you can do that with a lot of violence, and that's what happened in the early 20th century and during the Cold War. Sorry? Yeah. Yes, so it comes, yes, so it happens, and when it happens, it has to be accompanied by a lot of violence and a lot of deliberate attempt to keep the majority out of the center. You can do it, you don't have to do it, but when that happens, when there is a moment of democratization, then religion comes back in. And that's what happened. That's the story of Turkey, right? The democratization, religion comes back in, then the army comes back and protects the center. And that's the Cold War story. So what you read as secularization to me, is also a Cold War story, at least in the case of Turkey. So you have that back and forth between in places like Egypt and Turkey, the army and the conservative religious majority. But there's something unique or miraculous in the Turkish story when the AK Party, Erdogan's government, broke that cycle. They brought the conservative majority to the center, and there was no, coup. But they were able to do that because of the Gülenists, Gülenists were basically took over the state from the Kemalists, but they were secular in outlook. They were willing to partner with the United States. They were very liberal and capitalist, unlike the other Islamist movement of Turkey, which was anti-Western and anti-capitalist in many ways. And Gülenists provided the key for Erdogan to break that cycle and bring the conservative majority. And this brings me back to the question of Gülenists, whether they have a future in Turkey or in the US and so on. Because I have to be very short, we can continue the conversation later, but I think their story is over in Turkey. There's no, they won't come back. They have no credibility. They never had the social depth of Islamist movements of the 70s and 80s anyway in Turkey. It was still an elite cadre. In the diaspora, they are dismantling. There are many Gülenists who are disavowing or being very critical. They're writing in forums or coming out, so to speak, and sort of criticizing Gülen and his close surroundings. Gülen, yes, he's an old man, and a key element that I didn't talk about is the messianic aspect of the Gülenist movement. So when he dies, actually there's no one to replace him. But we have cases in history where a messianic movement is replaced, even when the leader dies, there's a new one, and he can continue the messianic project. So watch that space. Thanks.
Okay, with the indulgence of our hosts, we have time for 2 quick questions. So the gentleman there, yeah, you first, and then Anthony, quick. I emphasize the word quick questions. Oh, the mic has disappeared apparently. Okay, go ahead, Anthony.
This is not a new question. Stalin asked of the Vatican, how many divisions has the Pope? And in 50 years, the USSR collapsed. But what is very important is 1989. In 1989, Gorbachev went to Beijing and tried to convince of the goodness of glasnost and perestroika. But the Chinese did Tiananmen, and in the last 30 years, they just did business and became the second largest economy in the world. It's now we need to understand China, and if we talk about this is so transactional. We need to get into the process and to what is transformative. So in some extent, Serkan, you, the Turkish, are confusing the Chinese. You are collaborators with Gulen, all the great things in Gulen, and you are telling the Chinese, follow us. And the Chinese say, no, we want to be the biggest economic power. We don't want no Gulanis in Xinjiang, you know. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Bingqing Han from the China Embassy. And here I would like to say what you see in the media is not the reality in Xinjiang and in China. And I heard that about several days ago, the spokesman from the Turkish Foreign Ministry, they said that a famous Turkish or Uighur musician died in the jail in his term. But in fact, this man is living healthily and living a happy life during the Chinese Spring Festival in his family, and he is not in jail. So even the spokesman's evidence is fabricated. How can it be sure and trusted the news is real and the data is real? And my question is, Professor James Dorsey, have you ever been to China before, and where you get your data and materials? Can we be sure these things are first-hand data? Are they real? Can be trustworthy? And I got some data from the Chinese spokeswoman Hua Chunying yesterday, and there are 24,000 mosques in Xinjiang region alone. And there are 30 million Uyghurs, which means every 530 men shares one mosque. This percentage is higher than Turkish, which is 930. So how can you ensure we are so-called suppressing the Uyghurs? We have building so much mosques, and for a young man like me, I'm very concerned about the college education, and for the young men and young people in the Uyghurs, they can take their college entrance exam with their own language, and they were allowed 5 local languages, including Mandarin, Uyghurs, Kazakhstan, and other 2 languages, to use their own languages to take part in the college entrance examinations. So this is a respect to their own religions and their languages. And in fact, nowadays, the Uyghurs and other religious and other ethnic minorities, they can send their children to the religious schools, their mosques for freely. This is not what you see in the reality. So could you prove that your evidence are real and trustworthy? Thank you.
So, can you prove it?
Thank you for the comment. First of all, the burden of proof is on both sides. I noticed this morning in a number of tweets that the Chinese were being asked to produce a video that showed that Abdul Rahim Haid was still alive. And to the best of my knowledge, that video has not been produced yet. So, the truth is in the middle. I'm not going to get into a discussion with you on sources and whatever. I will say that I've been traveling to China since the mid-1970s, including to Xinjiang. And that I talk to people continuously. And I base my conclusions on that. And it is a very different picture than the picture that China would like us to believe. But as I said, the burden of proof is on both sides. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's time for me to draw the discussion to a close. I think it was a very fascinating panel. It's quite clear from the discussion that religion is a bit of a blind spot, certainly as far as the BRI and China's aspirations for the BRI is concerned. And this is something that will necessarily preoccupy Xi Jinping and the party in the years to come. I mean, it's one little loose thread, but we all know what one little loose thread that is left untended can do. It can unravel an entire piece of fabric. So on that note, please join me in thanking our panelists for fascinating discussion.